All right, so one of the main topics that has been a source of much contention and confusion, not just in Christianity, but in our nation and the world as a whole, has been the topic of marriage and just how we should understand that in the context of human sexuality. In just the last 20 to 30 years, we have seen a massive shift in our nation and how we speak about and approach this topic. And for those of us who are old enough to remember, it used to be widely accepted to affirm that marriage is a covenant between one man and one woman joined together in holy communion to death do they part. Now, this was just as universally accepted as the claim that chattel slavery is a moral evil. That's how prominent and widespread this was accepted. Now, of course, I'm speaking in hyperbole because not every single human being in our nation has agreed with this definition of marriage in times past. Like with all things, some people disagreed, but they were in the minority. And when I say minority, I'm not talking about they were the 49% of the country compared to the 51%. No, they were more like the 10% to 90% or something to that effect. The point that I'm trying to make is that this wasn't a debate for most of our nation's history and for most of human history when you actually come to think about it. Now, I know that comment deserves to be fleshed out a little bit more, and there needs to be a little bit more nuance attached to that, because there have been other types of marriages that kind of have shown its face in different parts of human history that were not exclusively one man and one woman. But again, if I'm speaking in broad terms and not in specifics, the traditional marriage was the norm. Right, that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the concept of marriage being between one man and one woman has been the norm for much of human history and not the exception, if you kind of catch my drift. But returning to the context of how this conversation has started to evolve in our nation, the idea has been more of a recent development to affirm that marriage is not simply between one man and one woman. And to illustrate this point, I'm going to show you two clips of our president, Joe Biden, on how he has evolved on this issue. And the reason why I'm using Joe Biden as an example to make my point is because he's never been one to go against the grain, so to speak. In other words, if majority of the country says that 2 plus 2 equals 5, then he's going to get up on the stage and say that 2 plus 2 equals 5. Like most politicians, he's always been willing to do anything for a vote. I think most people kind of understand that. All right, so with that in mind, let me show you the two clips of President Joe Biden talking about the topic of marriage and whether it's between one man and one woman or not. Okay, the first clip is going to be from 2006. Check this one out.
Used his radio address yesterday and tomorrow in the Rose Garden to talk about a constitutional amendment to ban gay marriage.
Think about this. The world's going to Hades in a handbasket. We are desperately concerned about the circumstance relating to avian flu. We don't have enough vaccines. We don't have enough police officers. And we're going to debate the next 3 weeks, I'm told, gay marriage, a flag amendment, and God only knows what else. I can't believe the American people can't see through this. We already have a law, the Defense of Marriage Act, where we've all voted, not where I voted and others said, look, marriage is between a man and a woman, and states must respect that. Nobody's violated that law. There's been no challenge to that law. Why do we need a constitutional amendment? Marriage is between a man and a woman. What's the game going on here?
All right, so you see how he was firm in that response, right? There was no mincing of words. This wasn't a soundbite that was taken out of context. This was his actual opinion, and the majority of Americans' opinion back in 2006. As I said, the idea that marriage was between one man and one woman was commonplace around that time. Now, of course, Joe Biden is answering questions about this around that time because this is also when we started to hear the early rumblings of the LGBT movement that, sought to change the concept of marriage and as it was currently, understood. But again, these were rumblings, a small minority of people who were starting to make a lot of noise, but it wasn't nothing major. Well, at least not yet. But moving on to the next clip, here's Joe Biden in 2012 talking about this very same issue. Check this clip out.
I'm curious, the president has said that his views on gay marriage, on same-sex marriage, have evolved, but he's opposed to it. You're opposed to it. Have your views evolved?
Look, I just think that the good news is that as more and more Americans come to understand what this is all about is a simple proposition. Who do you love? Who do you love? And will you be loyal to the person you love? And that's what people are finding out is what all marriages at their root are about. Whether they're marriages of lesbians or gay men or heterosexuals.
Is that what you believe now?
That's what I believe.
And you're comfortable with same-sex marriage now?
Look, I am Vice President of the United States of America. The President sets the policy. I am absolutely comfortable with the fact that men marrying men, women marrying women, and heterosexual men and women marrying women are entitled to the same exact rights, all the civil rights, all the civil liberties. And quite frankly, I don't see much of a distinction beyond that.
In a second term, will this administration come out behind same-sex marriage, the institution of marriage?
I can't speak to that. I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you.
But it sounds like you'd like to see it happen if that's where the president would get to.
The president continues to fight, whether it's don't ask, don't tell, or whether it is making sure across the board that you cannot discriminate. Look at the executive orders he's put in place. Any hospital that gets federal funding, which is almost all of them, they can't deny a partner from being able to have access to their partner's will or making the call on whether or not they, it's just, this is evolving. And by the way, my measure, David, and I take a look at when things really begin to change, is when the social culture changes. I think Will and Grace probably did more to educate the American public than almost anything anybody's ever done so far. And I think people fear that which is different. Now they're beginning to understand. They're beginning to understand that this as its base. I was speaking to a group of gay leaders in Los Angeles two weeks ago. And one gentleman looked at me in the question period and said, "Let me ask you, how do you feel about us?" And I had just walked into the back door of this gay couple, and there were their 2 adopted children. And I turned to the man who owned the house. I said, "What did I do when I walked in?" He said, "You walked right to my children. They were 7 and 5, and giving you flowers." And I said, "I wish every American could see the look of love those kids had in their eyes for you guys, and they wouldn't have any doubt about what this is about."
Okay, so you saw how his views changed in that clip. He went from giving a clear prohibition to the idea of defining marriage outside of one man and one woman in 2006, even going so far as to appeal to the Defense of Marriage Act, which prevented same-sex couples whose marriages were recognized by their home states from receiving the many benefits available to other married couples under federal law, to giving a clear endorsement of the very same idea 6 years later. Now look, everyone has a right to change their minds, but the point that I'm trying to make by showing these clips is that Biden only changes his mind on something when the world has changed its mind first, or when it shows that it would gain him an extra vote in, some recent or upcoming election. So one thing I want to say is I'm sorry to all of my Biden supporters out there, especially the people that are subscribed to this channel. This isn't some Trump 2024 presidential ad or commercial. Trust me, I have my own concerns about Trump, and I think, some of his problems have been well documented, especially in media. So please don't look at this video as that. That's not the purpose of this video, and that's not the point that I'm trying to come across or make. I'm just using Biden as an example to demonstrate how this non-issue of the definition of marriage has become an increasing issue throughout recent history. Now, of course, we all know what happens next. The US kind of springboards what it seems like the rest of the world into this new era of recognizing same-sex marriage as a legitimate form of marriage. The US wasn't the first country to legalize same-sex marriage, but they were the most notable to do it, if that makes sense. And now that enough time has passed since the legalization of same-sex marriage, we can kind of take a step back to see what were some of the long-form ramifications of that decision. Now, it's important to note that when the decision was being made, the reasoning for it was actually very similar to Joe Biden's reason for supporting it back in 2012, which is that you should be able to love whoever you want to love. right? It's their business who they want to spend the rest of their lives with, right? Why should we have a say on whose marriage should or should not be recognized? By what standard are we making that decision? Who or what are we appealing to that is saying that this must be the case? These were the types of questions people around the world had to wrestle with as this debate, ensued. As a Christian, I believe these questions were fairly easy to answer. It's got to be God, right? Well, although that is supposed to be the Christian response to these questions, not every professing Christian was willing to give that clear response to such, pressing questions. And that the key word there is professing Christians, because not everybody who was a Christian actually, not everybody who claimed to be a Christian was actually a Christian. That's something important to remember. Part of the reason for this, however, is because they felt peer pressure. It wasn't like the proponents of same-sex marriage were exactly trying to hear out the other opposing side's position. To affirm the idea that marriage is between a man and a woman was starting to be met with charges of homophobia, xenophobia, and pretty much any other phobia that you could honestly think of. And no one wants those charges to be attached to their name, right? I certainly don't. So many of them did not believe that this was a hill that they needed to die on or lose their job on. Many people believe that as long as they didn't try to force their views on us, as long as the LGBT community didn't try to force their views or their opinions on those who did not agree with their views on them, then they were good. Others could not give an answer to these questions because they believe that appealing to God in deciding on moral decisions in the country would lead to a soft type of theocracy and eventually lead to a theocratic nation altogether. They recognize that not everyone in the US is Christian. So what are we to say to someone who doesn't recognize the same source of authority as we do? Do you see how this posed a problem for this type of professing Christian as well? Sure, they believe that God was and is right and just in all that he said and did, but they were torn with the idea of imposing God's morality on those who do not believe that he existed to begin with. Now, there are many different reasons why professing Christians at that time and even to this day have a hard time giving a definite answers to these types of questions. Some other notable reasons are that they may have a friend or a relative who is in a same-sex relationship and they don't want to offend them. They may not want to lose their job or jeopardize their finances by taking such a hard stance on this, very controversial issue. And they may be wrestling with this issue themselves as someone who has same-sex attraction and may actually be torn between, knowing what the Bible says and then knowing what their flesh feels. There's so many different reasons. And so if that is what's going on in the Christian camp, you can only imagine what it was like in the atheist or agnostic camp. Many people in the atheist or agnostic camp had no one to appeal to except for themselves. They don't believe in God or the Bible or any religious institution for that matter to begin with. So if they were against same-sex marriage or just the redefinition of marriage, who or what were they going to appeal to? Do you see how that, started to pose a problem for them as well? Now, I know I only mentioned Christianity, but the same questions and concerns, were levied on Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, etc. Everyone had to answer this. No one was off the hook, right? So as we consider the long-term effects, it is important to also address these related questions as well. This is important to do because, as you can see, trying to answer this question of what is the definition of marriage starts to open Pandora's box, introducing a whole slew of other secondary issues that we were just not prepared to deal with. One of the questions that spring out of this box, which I believe underlies all of the other questions, is the question of who is the ultimate source of authority on moral issues. In other words, who or what defines morality? who defines marriage, and who says it is wrong or to redefine it. Is it us? Is it God? Is it our Supreme Court? Who is it? This is something everyone has to wrestle with. Some religious people oppose expanding the definition of marriage beyond one man and one woman, not solely based on personal preference, as contrary to what some people believe, but because they believe that God has ordained marriage to be between one man and one woman. If you're a proponent of same-sex marriage or any marriage outside of it being one man and one woman, you have to challenge the ultimate authority of moral issues to do that. That is essentially what the battle is all about, right? Whose source of authority is the ultimate source of authority on moral issues? And can there even be such a thing? Is there a source that we can look to for guidance on these issues, or is it all simply relative? You see, it is this type of thinking and frame of questioning that has led us to, other creations that have begun to, spring from this discussion. So again, considering the long-term effects of this issue, we now are starting to question, things like what is a woman or what is a man, things that were, very obvious biological and sociological facts for, again, most of human history that are now on the table for redefining, because again, what is being challenged in the question of marriage? What's being challenged is the whole foundation on which moral issues and truth itself is determined. Now, what do moral issues have to do with biological and sociological gender identities, right? Because it seems a little bit unrelated. Well, apparently it has everything to do with it. But again, setting that issue aside for, in terms of gender identity, we also have the issue of pedophilia and polygamy. Now, this has always been a thing, but it's never been an issue in terms of whether or not it's going to be something that the world accepts as, good. Some of you may be asking, what does this have to do with the redefinition of marriage? And the answer again is everything. Remember that in the pursuit of redefining marriage, we have officially challenged the whole foundation. And just like how marriage is no longer based on the definition explicated listed in God's word, but rather on the strength of one's argument or the majority opinion of a given society, the same will be the case for every other moral issue. That includes things like pedophilia and polygamy. The U.S. has not officially sanction either of those practices, the practice of pedophilia or the practice of polygamy. But I think many Americans and just individuals around the world can see the writing on the wall. The same questions that you were asked in the case of same-sex marriage, you're going to be asked in the case of pedophilia and polygamy. And when that happens, what will be your answer? Who's to say that in another 5 to 10 years, we won't be talking about how marriage should include those who, are pedophiles and are participating in polygamous relationships? I'm not trying to be facetious here. These are real questions that we have to wrestle with, and acting like they're not doesn't help the situation, right? Because it was the same way when the discussion of same-sex marriage was starting to ramp up. A lot of people really didn't take it serious. A lot of people really didn't think it was necessarily going to be that big of an issue. And then look at us, 5-10 years later. It was a real concern that we had to take very seriously, and that we had to come up with answers with, or at least think about in a more serious way. So, the question that, is going to be left in a lot of our minds is, what are we to do? Right? Well, I believe we ought to do a few things. The first thing that I believe we need to do is take an honest evaluation of the long-term effects of the decision to redefine marriage. And I'm not just talking about same-sex marriage in this part right here. I'm talking about just a general redefinition of marriage. This first step is important because if you're not willing to be honest with yourself here, then don't even try to do the other steps. Whether you're a Christian, a Muslim, an atheist, an agnostic, you have to ask yourself, is the redefinition of marriage better or worse for our society? And look, I'm going to be honest with you. Whenever I survey the land to see how this has played out in our recent history, it doesn't look well, right? It doesn't look promising, to be honest with you. It has only led to more division, more confusion, and more false charges of, homophobia, xenophobia, etc. Literally, anytime you show any form of disagreement with any of the LGBT, topics and things of that nature, or try to add some nuance into this discussion, or just try to take a firm stance in saying that, you don't, rock with that stuff. Maybe it's because of your religion. Maybe it's because you just don't think it's, beneficial for human flourishing. Whatever your reason is, you will be met with some strong claims against your moral character, right? Again, going to the claims of homophobia and xenophobia. So if we're to be honest with ourselves, we have to admit that these are not a net positive for our society. It doesn't further along the discussion. It doesn't build relationships. It just destroys them. The second thing that we need to do is compare and contrast different eras, right? Now, I know that this redefinition of marriage has not been around at nearly as long as the traditional definition of marriage has. However, I believe we have enough of a sample size to do a brief compare and contrast to see which is better in the long run. What are the pros and cons of each view? Again, we want to be honest with ourselves here. We want to try also to refrain from strawmanning the other side's position on this. And that goes for both sides, right? If you are a proponent of the traditional view of marriage, you don't want to kind of try to strawman the other side's position and, kind of be facetious with how you're talking about them. No, you actually want to deal with both of the views fairly so that you can get a better understanding of how to think about this conversation. And what I would recommend everybody to do is just deal with the facts, right? Let the facts speak for themselves and you just deal with them instead of you coming in with your own conception, your own thought narrative, and trying to shape that in some way, shape, or form, right? All right, so the third thing that we need to do is ask ourselves this: what would it look like if each view was done right? In other words, if we remove the offshoots, what are we left with? If traditional marriage was done right, and if same-sex marriage or any other type of marriage was done right, that means polygamous, whatever your definition of or your redefinition of marriage is, what would it look like if it was done right? Would it still be a net positive for society? Would it still be beneficial for human flourishing? Would it still be God's plan for creation? These are the types of questions that you want to wrestle with. Again, if I'm going to be honest, and giving my answer to this question, I believe that even if you remove all of the other problems that a looser definition of marriage leads to, you're still left with a lesser version of the traditional view of marriage, in my opinion, and it still leaves you with a slew of problems. And to hammer my point home, let's use same-sex marriage as an example. You still have to wrestle with the fact that our bodies were not meant to engage in sexual activity with the same sex. It just wasn't. Hence why those who do choose to engage in it have to take all types of medication and put in place all types of protections so that they don't, contract any diseases, because the fact of the matter is that it's dangerous. It's extremely dangerous. And this is something that's not just a heterosexual talking point, right? These are legit facts. You can read about them you can read about the different health risks on the Vanderbilt University Medical Center website. In their article, Key Health Concerns for MSM Men, basically men who have sex with men, they listed 10 health risks that sexually active gay men run into. I'll leave a link in the description box below for those who want to check out that article. I think it's very informative, very helpful. But not only that, you also have to consider the fact that it doesn't lead to procreation, meaning that if everyone engaged in same-sex relationships exclusively, the human race would cease to exist because no one would be able to have offspring. We have to ask ourselves, why that is. Even in the case of adoption, there are certain things women provide for a child that a man can't, and vice versa. You don't need to engage in multiple studies to see that. You don't need to try to do a test trial to see that obvious point. I believe this is fairly obvious, but even if you want to look at the studies done on this, you will see that a home with a father and a mother is way better for a child than a home that has a mother, a woman and a woman, a man and a man, and a man and multiple other women, etc. And look, I can go on, but I believe you kind of get the point. Again, I'm not trying to be facetious here. I'm just trying to be honest with the facts, and this is what it looks like to actually deal with the facts. Because again, this is not something that is debated within the scholarship. You can actually look up multiple articles on these different facts that I just laid out for you, and you're going to see the same thing. It's just apparent that the traditional view of marriage is the best view of marriage. Now, I can already hear some people saying, well, how about the traditional marriages where the man overpowers the woman and so on and so forth, right? The traditional marriages have problems too, right? They're not perfect. Well, the first thing I would remind everyone is that the scenario that I was giving everybody is for us to think if the traditional view of marriage or same-sex marriage or a polygamous marriage, if they are done right. So this is a hypothetical, right? I'm not saying that they're always done right. I'm saying in our hypothetical that we're doing right now, what would it look like if it was done right? And I believe that the issues that arise in traditional marriages are not a product of the union itself, but rather the byproduct of what happens when we deviate from its original purpose. In a traditional marriage, the goal is not for the woman to become the man's slave or something to that effect, but to become his wife, his partner. He serves her just as she serves him. They both come together to be one union, one flesh, right? We understand this because we are quick to point it out when we see it not done right. And I love this quote from C.S. Lewis, which says, "A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line." We know that abusive marriages are wrong because we have a concept of what a marriage is supposed to be like. Now, some people have a clear picture of what marriage is supposed to be like, a little bit more than others, but we all have a picture. Now, I'm confident that, after you complete those 3 steps that I've just laid out for you, you should come away with being at least more open to the idea of returning to the traditional definition of marriage. And if that is the case, I imagine that one of the questions that you're probably going to have for me is, what is marriage supposed to look like? Okay, Janai, you've convinced me that maybe I should give the thought of returning back to traditional marriage a more fair shake, right? But that still leaves me with a big problem. What is marriage supposed to look like? What is this peak view of marriage that you want us to accept, right? Where can we find a good breakdown of how it is supposed to look like? How can we make that blurry image of marriage clear? Well, I'm glad you asked all of those questions because I have a resource for you. So I want to recommend this book by Raymond C. Ortlund Jr. It says the book is titled Marriage and the Mystery of the Gospel. And here I'm going to show it in my screen. It's a very, very great book. This is a very short book. It's only about 128 pages, but man, is it informative and thorough in its message. In this book, Ortlund presents a clear and concise picture of what marriage is supposed to look like from a biblical perspective, right? And this book is broken down into 4 simple chapters. The first is on, marriage in Genesis. The second is on marriage in the law, wisdom, and prophets. And the third is marriage in the New Testament. And the last chapter is on marriage in the world today. Let me just tell you that each of these chapters is a must read. I remember reading it with my wife in our first year of marriage, and we wanted to read a chapter a week to let the information kind of sink in. But it was so hard because the book was so good. I can't say that for most books, but I can certainly say it for this one. The goal of this book, is not only to show you what the biblical view of marriage looks like, but also to show you how this institution that God has established is meant to foreshadow the gospel reality. And this is important because as we live in a world where we're constantly trying to redefine marriage, we also end up losing the purpose and the nuance within it. That's also one of the long-term effects of trying to redefine marriage, is we lose the purpose of it, right? In today's society, marriage has been, kind of relegated to just, a piece of paper, a contract or an agreement to love another person. When marriage is so much more than all of those things combined. This is the problem with trying to redefine marriage. Those who seek to redefine marriage, I believe never truly understood it in the first place. So if you want to understand it better, please do yourself a favor and get a copy of this book. It's only $15. It's very inexpensive. It's a quick read, and it's not loaded with a bunch of, super theological terms that may, get you disinterested. I know how important that is for those who are like me and typically don't like, reading to begin with. I know we can be picky when it comes to reading certain books, but no, this book passes the vibe test for sure. If I was to give a rating for this book, I would actually give it a 10 out of 10. Yes, it's that good. It just goes to show you that your book doesn't have to be extremely long to be good. You just need to write a good book. Now, I know that's a little bit easier said than done, but it can be done. And Raymond Ortlund, or Ray Ortlund, just showed us how to do that. But guys, what I wanted us to take away from this video is I want us to, when we're visiting the conversation of marriage, I want us to be honest with ourselves. Ask ourselves those important questions that gets to the heart of the issue, right? For those who are honestly looking at or looking into the question of what does a good traditional marriage look like, again, read this book. If you already are convinced that the traditional view of marriage is the, I guess you would say, superior view of marriage or the only view of marriage, again, you want to read this book, because I think the problem that we run into is the fact that a lot of people just don't understand what marriage was designed to do, what it looks like, how it points to not just our present reality, but a future reality as well. This marriage helps you. This book helps you do that. I can't recommend the book enough. But of course, I'll leave the link to purchase the book in the video description below. So if you want to go and purchase that, please be my guest. I don't make any money off of it, so I have nothing to gain from promoting this book. It's just a good read. But anyways, guys, that's the video. Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I really want to know what you have to say on this topic. Hopefully we can have a respectful dialogue in the comment section. As always, if you liked the video, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and sharing it with someone who may find it helpful. Thank you to all of those who have supported me this year, as we're coming to a close in the year 2023 and starting the year 2024 off with a bang. I hope that you all have a very happy new year, but until next time, guys, peace.